My daughter-in-law skipped my husband's funeral to fly to Dubai with another man. That day, my son looked me in the eyes and struck my face for telling him the truth. The sting of his hand was nothing compared to the crack in my heart. I thought grief had already taken everything from me, but I was wrong. There was still a darker plan unfolding in my own kitchen, one that would test the limits of a mother's strength and a woman's will to survive. It was a grey morning on the Oregon coast, the kind that makes the ocean look heavier than the sky. The church smelled faintly of salt and old wood, the pews polished from years of hands sliding along them. I stood at the front, looking out over faces that had known my husband for decades. Some smiled gently in memory, others looked down at their hands, but all had shown up to honor him. All but one. The chair in the front row, right beside my son Brian, was empty. I had known it would be. Still, when my eyes landed there, it hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. Marissa, my daughter-in-law, had sent me a brief message that morning. A ticket to Dubai had been booked weeks in advance. She would not be attending. I had read it twice, as if the words might change, but they did not. Brian sat stiff, his jaw tight, pretending not to notice the gap beside him. I kept my voice steady as I began to speak about my husband. I told the story of the first time we met, the way he used to laugh when the gulls would steal fries from the dockside cafe, the summer nights we spent walking the beach barefoot. My words floated into the air, but the space beside my son felt like it was swallowing all the warmth in the room. When the service ended, people came to hug me, pressing my hands, whispering their condolences. I felt their kindness, but also the curiosity in their glances toward that empty seat. Outside, the wind was sharp, the kind that pushes your breath back into your chest. I stood near the church steps, watching Brian shake hands with old family friends. He avoided my eyes, speaking quickly, then slipping away before I could say much. By the time I returned home, the tide was already turning. The house felt too still. My husband's jacket still hung on the hook by the door, his boots neatly lined up under the bench. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the grain of the wood, the same table where we had eaten nearly every meal for 45 years. The silence pressed in until I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the years we had welcomed Marissa into our family, how I had given her a warm coat the first winter she moved here, taught her the secret to my husband's favorite chowder. I had believed she cared for him, even respected our life here. Yet she had chosen a trip with someone else over standing beside her husband to bury his father. The worst part was knowing the gossip would travel fast in our small coastal town. People would wonder why she had not been there, and some would already be making their own guesses. I wanted to believe there was some reason I did not yet understand, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. I made tea, but it cooled untouched on the counter. My hands felt cold even wrapped around the mug. I replayed the morning in my head, from the moment I walked into the church to the way Brian's eyes seemed to harden each time they met mine. I could not shake the feeling that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. As the day faded, the ocean grew louder outside, waves striking the rocks with a rhythm that had been there long before me and would continue long after. I sat in the armchair by the window, looking at the strip of beach that had been ours for so many years. The tide was pulling out now, leaving behind pools of water that caught the last of the light. I told myself this was just the first day without him, and that tomorrow I would find a way to start again. But deep down, I sensed this was only the beginning of something heavier. The empty chair at the funeral was not just a seat someone had chosen to skip. It was a signal, one I could not yet fully read, but I knew it would come to mean far more than I wanted it to. Some stories in a family reveal themselves slowly, like the tide inching up the shore. Others arrive like a wave breaking all at once. I had a feeling I was about to face both. The evening after the funeral, the house felt heavier than it had all day. I moved through the rooms without turning on many lights, letting the dimness cover me. I heard Brian's car pull into the driveway, and for a brief moment, I thought he might have come to sit with me. When the door opened, he stayed standing near the threshold, his coat still on. I told him we needed to talk about Marissa. His eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing his face. I said I knew she had gone to Dubai with another man. I said it quietly, not looking to start a fight, but unable to keep the truth to myself any longer. The silence between us stretched thin. His voice came out sharp, accusing me of trying to create problems in his marriage. He stepped closer, the space between us shrinking until I could see the anger in his jaw. When his hand struck my cheek, it was quick, almost as if he wanted it over before either of us could think. The sting spread across my skin, but it was nothing compared to the ache that bloomed in my chest. He pulled back, his breathing uneven. For a second, I thought I saw doubt flicker in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He turned toward the door, muttering that he could not be in the same house right now. The sound of the door closing was sharper than the wind outside. I stood in the middle of the living room, one hand lightly against my cheek, the other hanging useless at my side. The room seemed unfamiliar, like I had walked into a place I used to know. My husband's photograph on the mantel caught my eye. His smile, frozen in time, felt like it belonged to a life I could no longer reach. The night settled in, but I could not bring myself to draw the curtains. The street lamp outside cast a narrow beam across the floor, a reminder that the world kept moving even as mine had paused. I moved to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, but it tasted flat. I replayed the moment over and over, not just the strike itself, but the choice behind it. I had raised my son to face the truth, even when it hurt. Yet here he was, defending someone who had chosen absence over respect. I thought about the years I had stood by him, the nights I stayed awake waiting for him to come home as a teenager, the times I defended him when others judged. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. I sat at the table, tracing the pattern in the wood grain with my finger. I realized that what hurt most was not the physical act, but the confirmation that something had shifted in him. It was as if a wall had gone up and I was now on the outside. Hours passed before I finally moved to the bedroom. The sheets felt cold, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the faint sound of waves in the distance. I knew sleep would not come easily. My mind kept circling back to the empty chair that morning, the quiet tension in Brian's shoulders, the way his voice had hardened. Somewhere between the tide coming in and the wind rattling the windows, I understood that this was not a moment I could undo. Words, once spoken, could not be taken back. Actions, once made, could not be erased. When dawn began to creep through the blinds, I was still awake. The light revealed the faint red mark on my cheek, now dulled, but still present. I sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my neck. The day ahead seemed uncertain, but I knew one thing. I could not pretend nothing had happened. The balance in my family had shifted, and no amount of silence would return it to the way it was. I walked to the kitchen and looked out at the narrow strip of beach in the distance. The tide was low, revealing dark rocks and small pools left behind. It reminded me that what is hidden will eventually be uncovered, no matter how carefully it is kept beneath the surface. In that moment, I knew the events of last night were only the first sign of something far deeper, and it would be impossible to ignore for long. A week had passed since Brian left the house that night, and the silence inside had taken on a different weight. I had learned to live with quiet over the years, especially after my husband's illness, but this was not the same. This quiet carried an edge, like something unseen was moving under it. It was on a Tuesday afternoon when Marissa showed up unannounced. She came through the back door carrying a container of soup, smiling just enough to make it look like a peace offering. The smell was rich, almost too rich for something she claimed to have made quickly. I accepted it without much to say. Later, after heating a small bowl, I took a few spoonfuls. The broth was smooth, but there was a faint taste that didn't belong. Not bitter exactly, but wrong. It clung to the back of my tongue in a way that was hard to name. I pushed the bowl aside and poured the rest down the sink. My stomach felt uneasy, though it could have been my nerves. That night, I woke with a dull headache and a strange dryness in my mouth. I tried to convince myself it was from the wind coming through the bedroom window, but the thought didn't settle. By morning, the feeling had eased, but something about it stayed with me. I began paying closer attention to the things Marisa brought over. A loaf of bread, still warm, but with a crust that tasted slightly metallic. A salad with dressing that left a faint film on my teeth. Each time, the flavor was subtle enough to pass as a quirk of ingredients, but my years in the food business told me not to ignore patterns. Back when I ran the stores, I trained my staff to recognize the smallest changes in fresh produce, to notice when spices had been stored improperly, to send back shipments that didn't smell right. That habit of attention was still with me. Now it was directed at my own kitchen. I started keeping a notebook on the counter. In it, I wrote the date, what I ate, and how I felt afterward. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't proof, just a log, but I needed a record. I also began saving small portions of anything she brought, sealing them in jars and placing them in the back of the refrigerator where I knew she would not look. The next time she visited, I noticed the way she watched me take the first bite. Her eyes stayed on my face, as if she was searching for a reaction. I took my time, placing my spoon down between sips, and finally set the bowl aside after only a few mouthfuls. Her smile tightened, and she quickly changed the subject to how busy Brian had been at work. That night, I felt a slow wave of fatigue move through me, different from ordinary tiredness. My hands felt heavier than usual, my breathing just slightly shallow. I lay in bed listening to the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway, each second falling a little harder than the last. By morning, the symptoms had faded again. That was when I realized how deliberate it must be. Not enough to cause alarm, just enough to wear me down over time. I began to replay our interactions in my mind, looking for signs I had missed. The way she lingered in the kitchen, the casual way she asked if I had been sleeping well, her sudden interest in making sure I had something home cooked. Even her tone had changed, softer on the surface, but with an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. I told myself I could be wrong. It could all be coincidence. But the unease in my chest would not go away. I had lived too long, seen too much in business and in life, to dismiss instincts that strong. The notebook entries began to form a pattern. Foods she prepared and brought herself were the only ones that left me feeling off. Anything I cooked with my own ingredients gave me no trouble. That was enough to confirm what my gut had been telling me. I also started noticing how she avoided eating the food she gave me. She would offer a slice of bread or a serving of stew, but never took any for herself. If I asked, she would claim she had already eaten. I kept those moments in my mind, storing them alongside the dates and descriptions in my log. By the end of that week, I knew I needed to take the next step. Quiet suspicion was one thing, but if I was right, I would need something that could stand beyond my word. I thought about the store managers I had trained, the way we used to document every shipment and supplier issue to protect against disputes. The same principle would apply here. except the stakes were far higher. The decision settled in me with a kind of cold clarity. I would keep observing, keep recording, and I would start thinking about how to watch without being seen. Whatever was happening in my kitchen was not going to stay in the shadows forever. I had no proof yet, but I had the start of a trail, and I intended to follow it, no matter where it led. The pattern in my notes was no longer something I could explain away. The difference between the days I ate my own food and the days I accepted hers was too sharp to ignore. I knew I needed more than a notebook if I was going to prove anything. I called Miles Carter, the attorney I had trusted for years. His voice was steady as I told him the situation in plain terms. He did not question my instincts. Instead, he explained what I could legally do inside my own home. Cameras in common areas, audio in spaces I owned, careful chain of custody if I planned to use any of it later. He spoke in the same calm, precise tone he used when walking me through property agreements, but this time his words carried a different weight. That afternoon, I met with a woman named Ava Tran in the back corner of a small coffee shop. Miles had recommended her, saying she handled discreet security work and understood how to stay within the law. Ava was quick, direct, and didn't waste words. She listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing slightly when I mentioned the changes in my health. She opened a small black case on the table and showed me what she had brought. There was a camera no bigger than a button that could be hidden in a potted plant. Another was shaped like a motion detector, meant for a hallway. The audio devices were even smaller, meant to fit inside an outlet cover or the base of a lamp. She explained how they would store everything with timestamps, making it easier to match recordings to my notes. 2 days later, she came to the house just after sunrise. We walked each room together, deciding where to place the equipment. In the kitchen, she tucked a camera into the soil of the orchid by the window, the lens blending into the shadows of the leaves. A small audio device slid into the outlet by the counter where Marissa often set down her bags. In the living room, another camera faced the sofa, angled so it also caught part of the dining table. I paid Ava $8,500 in cash, pulling the bills from an envelope I had kept for emergencies. That money had been set aside to fix the roof before winter, but I figured a dry ceiling meant nothing if I could not protect myself. She left me with a small monitor I could keep in my bedroom, along with instructions on how to retrieve and save files. The first few days passed without incident. Marissa didn't come by, and I began to wonder if she had sensed a change. But on Friday afternoon, I saw her pull into the driveway from the small monitor screen. She was carrying a paper bag from a bakery 2 towns over, the kind that usually sold pastries and fresh bread. I sat in the living room as she came in, acting as if nothing had been wrong between us. She placed the bag on the counter, took out a loaf, and began slicing it. Through the orchid camera, I later saw her pause, glance toward the doorway, and slip something from her coat pocket into her hand before leaning over the cutting board. It was quick, practiced, and would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. When she offered me a piece, I took it, but set it on a napkin instead of eating. I watched her eyes again. There was that same faint watchfulness, as if she was waiting for something to happen. I excused myself to the kitchen a few minutes later, wrapped the bread in foil, and slid a piece into one of the jars at the back of the refrigerator. That evening, I reviewed the footage. The moment she slipped her hand into her pocket was clear. So was the way she looked toward the doorway, her expression tightening for a split second before smoothing over. The audio caught her humming softly to herself, then the faint sound of paper crinkling. It was not proof of what she had added, but it was the first solid piece I could add to the trail. I saved the file to a separate drive and labeled it with the date. Then I added a new column to my notebook, marking the times she visited and cross-referencing them with the video. Seeing it laid out like that made the pattern impossible to deny. Over the next week, I felt the atmosphere in the house shift. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt like a net I had thrown over the space, one that she could not see. I still had no clear picture of her endgame, but for the first time since my suspicions began, I felt like I had moved a step ahead. The roof would have to wait. The cameras and the recordings had become my insurance now. I knew the days ahead would bring more visits, more chances for her to make her move, and when she did, I would be watching. 3 days after I caught Marissa's hand slipping into her pocket, I was at the small monitor in my bedroom when her voice came through, low and sharp. She was standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, moving slowly around the counter as if she was alone. I reached for the volume and let the audio fill the room. The first words I heard were about me. She was telling someone that I would not last much longer, that Brian would come around once things settled, that everything would be easier when the house and accounts were free to be used. My hands tightened on the edge of the desk. Then I heard another voice on the line, deep and steady, familiar in a way that made my skin prickle. It took me only a moment to place it. 15 years earlier, that voice had filled my office, pitching a deal I had turned down without hesitation. Raymond Calloway. Back then, he had tried to buy the chain of stores I had built from nothing, and when I refused, his finances collapsed within the year. The papers called it a bad investment cycle. I had always suspected he blamed me for every dollar he lost. Now, hearing him talk with my daughter-in-law about splitting my estate made the old tension snap back into focus. His tone had not changed. Calm, assured, the way a man speaks when he thinks the outcome is already his. He told her to keep the process slow, that there was no rush as long as I seemed to be declining naturally. She agreed without hesitation. I played the recording again, this time listening for details. He mentioned a property in Arizona he planned to buy once the money came through. She brought up moving out of state, somewhere warm. They spoke about selling my house quickly, about liquidating accounts, even about how to handle the life insurance payout. It was not a conversation made in the heat of anger. It was organized, deliberate. When the call ended, Marissa lingered in the kitchen, checking the fridge, looking through the pantry. She moved like she was already in her own home. I sat still in my chair, the glow of the monitor casting my reflection back at me. That night, I pulled the old file box from the closet. Inside were documents from the years I ran the business, including correspondence from the failed deal with Calloway. I found the letter where I had formally declined his offer, along with notes I had taken after our last meeting. I remembered the way he had looked across the table, polite but cold, the way his jaw had tightened when I told him no. It occurred to me that this might not be just about money for him. This could be about erasing me, removing the reminder of a time he had been outmaneuvered by someone he underestimated. Marissa, with her willingness to play her part, was the perfect partner for him. I added the new audio file to my growing collection, labeling it with the date and a brief summary. My notebook now had a section marked for calls, each entry cross-referenced with timestamps from the recordings. The structure made me feel steadier, like each piece I gathered was another layer of protection. Over the next week, I kept the monitor close. Twice more, I heard his voice. Once discussing a bank account, once asking her if she had noticed any changes in my behavior. Each time, she reported calmly, like someone giving a status update on a project. I started to notice the rhythm of her visits. Midweek, usually in the afternoon, never when Brian was home. She came with something to eat or drink, always packaged in a way that suggested care. But the footage told a different story. Sometimes she would pause by the orchid, adjusting the leaves, not realizing she was inches from the camera lens. Other times she would take her phone calls by the kitchen window, where the microphone in the outlet caught every word. It was a strange kind of waiting, knowing the danger was real, but also knowing I was not powerless. The recordings gave me a kind of distance, letting me see her as she was when she thought no one was watching. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table after reviewing another clip and felt the shift in my own thinking. This was no longer about proving something to myself. It was about building a case that no one could ignore, not even Brian. The truth was no longer mine alone. It was becoming a set of files, dates, and voices that could stand on their own. Before bed, I took the envelope of cash I kept in my dresser and counted what was left after paying Ava. There was enough to keep the system running for months if I needed it. Enough to hold the line until I was ready for whatever came next. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows, but I felt anchored. For the first time since the empty chair at the funeral, I was not just reacting, I was preparing. The voice from my past had returned, but this time, I would be the one deciding how the story ended. The following week began with an unexpected knock at my back door. When I opened it, Marissa was standing there holding a covered casserole dish. She smiled, but there was no warmth in her eyes. I let her in without a word and watched her set the dish on the counter. She spoke in a light voice about how she wanted to check on me, how she thought a home-cooked meal might help. I told her I was fine, but she continued to hover in the kitchen, talking about the weather, about how busy Brian had been. When she left, I sat at the table and stared at the dish. I had no intention of eating it. Instead, I took a portion, sealed it in one of the jars I kept in the back of the fridge, and poured the rest down the drain. My stomach was already tight from the simple act of letting her into the house. That night, as I lay in bed, a faint dizziness began to settle in. My limbs felt heavy, and my vision blurred at the edges. It passed after a few hours, but the pattern was clear now. She was increasing her visits and adjusting her approach. The next morning, I called Miles. I told him everything I had recorded so far, including the calls with Calloway. His voice stayed even, but I could hear the edge in it. He told me that if I was ready to act, we could involve the police. I said I wanted to be certain there would be no room for doubt. He suggested a meeting with Detective Hall, someone he trusted to handle matters like this quietly until the right moment. We met 2 days later in Miles's office. Detective Hall was a tall man with calm eyes who listened without interrupting as I laid out the notebook, the recordings, the stored food samples. When I finished, he nodded slowly and asked me to consider a plan that might force the truth into the open. That was when the idea of staging my own collapse was first spoken aloud. It sounded theatrical in my head, but Hall explained how it could work. A carefully planned incident, medical staff already alerted, a controlled environment where every step was documented. The goal was to see how Marissa reacted when she believed she had succeeded. I sat back in my chair and let the thought settle. It was risky, but it gave me a way to take control without confronting her directly. I agreed, and we began to outline the steps. Hall would coordinate with a small group in the local hospital, people who could be trusted to keep quiet. Miles would ensure the legal side was covered, making sure every piece of evidence was preserved properly. The plan was simple in theory. Marissa would be invited to a dinner at my house. Food would be prepared by her, as always. I would consume just enough to make her believe I had taken in whatever she added. Within an hour, I would stage a collapse in the kitchen. An ambulance, already briefed, would arrive within minutes. Brian would be called, along with a few others, to witness the urgency of the situation. What Marissa would not know was that the entire evening would be recorded on multiple devices, and that the samples from the dinner would be taken directly to a lab under police supervision. In the days leading up to it, I felt an odd calm settle over me. There was fear, of course, but also a sense of direction. For weeks I had been reacting, adapting, watching. Now I was moving toward a definitive moment. I made small preparations at home, checking the placement of cameras, ensuring fresh batteries were in the audio devices. Ava stopped by to adjust the angles so nothing would be missed. Miles brought over a secure storage case for the recordings, one that could be handed directly to Hall after the dinner. The evening came sooner than I expected. Marissa arrived in a fitted black dress, carrying a large covered dish. She smiled broadly when I opened the door, stepping inside as if she belonged there. I watched her move around the kitchen, placing the food on the counter, unpacking utensils she claimed to have brought from home. I kept my hands steady as I accepted a plate from her. The cameras caught every movement, every glance she cast toward me. I ate slowly, careful to leave most of it untouched. The taste was faintly familiar now, that same wrongness I had come to recognize. An hour later, as she cleared the plates, I let my body sway slightly before sinking to the floor. I heard her call my name sharply, then the hurried sound of her phone being pulled from her purse. Within minutes, the ambulance was at the door, the paramedics moving with quiet efficiency as they loaded me in. From the corner of my vision, I caught a glimpse of her standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She did not follow us to the hospital. That was part of the plan. As the ambulance pulled away, I felt the weight of the moment settle in. For the first time since the empty seat at the funeral, I was not just enduring what came. I was shaping it. And soon, the truth she had worked so hard to hide would be brought into the open, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for her to twist. The morning after the staged collapse, I was lying in a private room at the hospital, wide awake, listening to the muffled footsteps in the hallway. Detective Hall had arranged everything exactly as we planned. The blinds were drawn, and a nurse who was part of the team checked on me periodically, making sure no one from outside the approved list could enter. My chart reflected a critical but stable condition, enough to make it believable that I was resting after a serious incident. Back at the house, the team was setting the second phase into motion. The obituary had been quietly drafted and sent to a small local paper that only posted online, knowing it would circulate fast enough to reach Marissa and Calloway, but still remain under the radar of people who could inadvertently reveal the truth too soon. Hall told me that timing was everything. We needed to give them just enough space to act without suspecting they were being watched. By late afternoon, word of my supposed death had spread through the right channels. The cameras inside my house were still running, and Ava had confirmed they were streaming directly to a secure police server. I had not seen the footage yet, but Hall's text later that evening told me that Marissa had arrived within an hour of the news breaking. She was dressed in black, her hair neatly pulled back, as if she had stepped straight into the role of a grieving widow-in-law. She let herself in through the front door, walking with quick, purposeful steps. In her hand was a phone, and within minutes she was in the kitchen, speaking in a low voice. The audio picked up her telling Calloway that it was over, that she would start sorting through my things by the end of the week. She mentioned the house, my accounts, and how she planned to meet with a realtor she already knew. Hall later told me she opened drawers, checked files, and even pulled out the small box where I kept property deeds. The box was empty, of course. Miles had secured all the important papers days before the plan was put into motion. 2 days after the news had spread, Hall arranged for a controlled memorial gathering at my house. Only a few people were invited, just enough to make it look genuine. Marissa played the part well, accepting condolences with a tight smile, her voice carefully lowered. Brian was there too, standing off to the side, his face pale and tense. I imagined he was struggling with his own feelings, caught between grief and confusion, not yet aware of the truth. Throughout the small service, Marissa stepped outside several times to take calls. The recordings captured her final conversation with Calloway before everything shifted. She told him to be ready to come over that evening, that they could start sorting items before Brian got involved. He agreed, mentioning that he had a buyer already lined up for one of the properties. That was when Hall gave the signal. As they spoke, a plain car pulled up a block away. Officers in plain clothes positioned themselves out of sight, ready to move. The plan was to let them enter the house together, ensuring the charges would be airtight. Later that night, with the memorial long over and most people gone, Marissa returned with Calloway at her side. They carried large bags and headed straight for the study. The cameras caught them opening drawers, checking for valuables, and discussing which items to take first. Calloway suggested starting with jewelry and electronics, while Marissa focused on finding the safe she believed was hidden in the house. The audio from that moment was clear. She told him she had been careful for months, adding small amounts so that no one would notice. She laughed when he asked if I had ever suspected. It was the kind of laugh that carried no hesitation, only certainty. That was when the front door opened, and the sound of footsteps filled the hallway. The officers moved in quickly, identifying themselves. Marissa's voice rose in protest, but the evidence was already in hand. Calloway froze, his face turning to stone as he realized the cameras were not just in the room, but throughout the house. Within minutes, both were in handcuffs, escorted out past the neighbors who had gathered after seeing the police cars. Hall made sure the files, the recordings, and the stored food samples were all documented and secured as part of the case. From the hospital, I received the news in a single call from Miles. His voice was calm, almost relieved. It was over. The months of suspicion, the careful logging of details, the quiet endurance, all of it had led to this point. I lay back against the pillow, the steady hum of the monitors around me, and let myself take one full breath without the weight that had been pressing on me for so long. The next morning, Hall visited me in person. He said the evidence was strong, that the charges would hold, and that there was no way for them to explain it away. I nodded, knowing that this was the moment the balance had finally shifted. I was no longer just the target in their plan. I was the reason it had collapsed. The following morning, the hospital felt quieter than usual. Sunlight pressed through the blinds in pale strips, catching on the edge of the chair where Detective Hall sat with a folder balanced on his knee. He laid it on the rolling table beside my bed and told me everything had been logged, sealed, and transferred to the district attorney's office. The audio, the video, the food samples, even the transcripts from their calls were now part of the official case. It was no longer a private battle. It was on record. I asked him to walk me through how it unfolded after they entered the house. He described it in his measured way, careful and factual. Both Marissa and Calloway had been caught in the act, handling items and speaking about the plan openly. The cameras left no gaps. The food samples matched the lab results, showing traces of a toxin, administered in doses too small to kill quickly, but enough to cause long-term damage. Hearing it all laid out like that confirmed what I had lived with for months. Brian had been called to the station late that night. Hall said he sat in silence at first, watching the recordings without speaking. When the footage reached the moment where Marissa laughed about my suspicion, his shoulders slumped. He stayed long enough to give a brief statement, then left without asking to see her. Later that afternoon, Miles came to see me with a printed summary of the charges: attempted homicide, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft in the first degree. The evidence was strong enough that both would be held without bail until their first court appearance. He also handed me an inventory of the items recovered from their bags that night: documents with my name on them, pieces of jewelry, even a small box of family photographs I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. I signed the papers authorizing the return of my belongings and sat for a while with the box on my lap. Inside were photos from years ago, birthdays, vacations, a picture of Brian as a boy holding his father's hand on the pier. I wondered how something so simple could be part of the same pile as the evidence of their greed. By the end of the week, I was discharged from the hospital. Hall drove me home himself, making sure the locks had been changed and the cameras removed. The house felt both familiar and strange, as if it had been waiting for me, but was now marked by the memory of what had happened inside its walls. I walked through each room slowly, pausing in the kitchen where the orchid still sat by the window. Its leaves hid the small lens that had turned the tide. 2 days later, Hall arranged for me to watch the final compilation of footage. It played in sequence, from the first moments of Marissa entering my home, weeks ago, to the night they were arrested. The progression was stark. Her confidence growing, his voice more frequent, their conversations shifting from cautious to certain. Seeing it all in one thread made it impossible to mistake for anything but intent. I asked for a copy, not because I needed to relive it, but because I wanted to have the complete truth in my hands. For so long, the reality had been mine alone, hidden in quiet suspicion and private notes. Now it was undeniable, preserved in images and words that no one could twist. Brian came to the house the following evening. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. His voice was quieter than I remembered, and he spoke carefully, as if each word carried weight. He admitted that he had believed her, that he had chosen her side without asking questions. He did not try to excuse it. I listened, letting the words settle between us. We did not speak of forgiveness that night. It was too soon. But when he left, I noticed he had placed the photograph of him and his father back on the mantel. That was enough for now. The legal process would take months, Miles said. There would be hearings, motions, and the slow machinery of the court. I was prepared for that. What mattered was that the plan they had built so carefully had been broken open, not by confrontation or shouting, but by patience, by careful steps, and by refusing to look away when something was wrong. On the first quiet morning after their arrest, I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of tea. The sea was calm, the tide low, the air carrying the faint scent of salt. For the first time in a long while, the quiet in the house did not feel dangerous. It felt earned. The walls no longer held their voices, only mine. And I intended to keep it that way. The days after returning home were filled with a strange mix of stillness and movement. The house was quiet, yet my mind remained busy, sorting through everything that had happened. I found myself opening drawers, not to check for missing items, but to reclaim the sense that this space was mine again. The scent of the sea drifted in through the open windows, blending with the faint smell of fresh paint from where a few scuffed walls had been touched up. Detective Hall stopped by one morning with updates on the case. He said the district attorney was confident, given the weight of the evidence. Marissa's attorney had already requested a deal, but the charges were too severe and the proof too solid. Calloway, on the other hand, had refused to speak, his silence holding steady through every interview. Hall said the trial would likely happen within the year, and when it did, both would face the kind of sentencing that would keep them far from here for a long time. I listened, nodding slowly. It was the outcome I had worked toward, yet I felt no rush of victory. What I felt was something quieter, relief, tempered by the awareness of how close it had all come to succeeding. Brian came by more often now. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes he just sat in the living room with a cup of coffee. We didn't dwell on the past, but we didn't avoid it either. There were moments when his voice caught, when he seemed about to say more but stopped. I let him set the pace. Trust was not something to be rebuilt overnight. One afternoon, I found him standing by the kitchen window, looking at the orchid. He asked if it was the same one from before. I told him yes, though the camera was long gone. He touched one of the leaves gently, as if acknowledging what it had seen. There was no need to explain further. In the evenings, I started walking down to the beach again. The tide had shifted with the season, leaving long stretches of wet sand scattered with shells. I would stand at the edge of the water, watching the waves pull back and return, the same rhythm that had steadied me through other hard years. I thought about my husband and how he would have handled all this. He would have told me to keep my head, to trust what I knew to be true. The community had begun to hear pieces of the story. In a small coastal town, news moves in quiet but certain ways. A neighbor would stop me on the street, offering a look that carried both sympathy and curiosity. I kept my answers simple. The details could wait until the courtroom. Miles visited one evening with more paperwork. He had arranged for the financial accounts to be secured and the estate documents updated. We sat at the dining table going through each page, the sound of pen on paper steady in the room. When we finished, he closed the folder and told me something I hadn't realized I needed to hear, that I had handled this with more resolve than most people could imagine. I didn't respond right away, but his words stayed with me after he left. The trial preparation brought its own demands. Hall wanted me to review the footage again, this time focusing on the clearest moments for presentation. It was not easy, watching Marissa move through my home, hearing her voice talk about my life as if it were already hers. But I reminded myself that each clip was another stone in the foundation of the case. I noticed small things in the recordings I had overlooked before. A look exchanged between her and Calloway, the way she handled my belongings, the slight change in her tone when she thought she was unobserved. These details were more than just background. They revealed intent. Hall said such subtleties could carry weight in court, helping the jury see what was behind their actions. On a cold evening, I sat in the living room with the fire lit, the orchid on the windowsill, and realized the house no longer felt like it held shadows. It was mine again, not because the threat was gone, but because I had faced it and taken it apart piece by piece. The process ahead would be long, but it no longer felt like a fight for survival. It was now about ensuring the truth stood where everyone could see it. I had the evidence, the support, and the steadiness to carry it through. Before bed that night, I stood at the window, looking out at the dark stretch of ocean. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke, the kind of scent that makes you think of winters past. I thought about the months behind me, the quiet observations, the careful steps, the moments of doubt, and felt the weight of them settle into something solid. The house was safe, the tide was steady, and I was still here. That, I decided, was enough for now. Winter settled over the town with a sharp wind that rattled the branches outside my bedroom window. The trial date was now fixed on the calendar, a point in time that felt both close and distant. Each day seemed to stretch as preparations continued, yet the weeks slipped past faster than I expected. The case was no longer just in the hands of Detective Hall and Miles. The district attorney's team had taken the lead, building the narrative from the recordings, the food samples, and the financial evidence. I was called in for a series of meetings at the courthouse. The prosecutors wanted to hear my account in detail, making sure it aligned with the physical evidence. We sat in a small conference room with plain walls, the air faintly smelling of coffee from the machine in the hall. I spoke in the same steady voice I had used when recording my notes months earlier, describing each step as it happened. They listened closely, occasionally asking me to clarify timing or sequence. One of the assistant prosecutors explained how the case would likely unfold in court. First, The video footage would be introduced, showing Marissa and Calloway in the house. Then the audio recordings would play, each one tied to a timestamp and my written notes. Finally, the forensic evidence from the food samples would be presented, linking the toxins directly to meals she had prepared. They wanted the story to be airtight, leaving no space for doubt. At home, I found myself moving through the rooms differently now. I would pause in the kitchen, my hand resting on the counter where she once stood, or in the living room where Calloway had searched for valuables. These spots no longer carried the same sense of intrusion. They were just places again, returned to the rhythm of my own life. Brian's visits continued. He asked more questions now, not about the details of the case, but about the years before all this. We spoke of my husband, of the early days building the business, of the trips we used to take when Brian was a boy. These conversations were small steps, but they mattered. They shifted the weight between us, making space for something like understanding. A few days before Christmas, Hall brought over copies of my official witness statement, along with a letter from the district attorney confirming my role as the primary witness. He also handed me a sealed envelope containing still photographs taken from the video footage. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were moments frozen in time. Marissa slipping her hand into her pocket, Calloway leaning over my desk, the two of them speaking in low voices. The clarity of those images left no room for reinterpretation. The town remained watchful but polite. People nodded when I passed, some offering a quiet greeting, others simply making space on the sidewalk. I knew the story would surface in full once the trial began, but for now, it lingered beneath the surface. In the last week of the year, I returned to my walks along the beach. The sand was cold beneath my shoes, the wind sharp against my face. I carried a small notebook in my coat pocket, jotting down thoughts as they came. It was not for evidence anymore, but for myself, a habit that had become a steady anchor during uncertain months. The trial preparation reached its final stage in January. I met again with the prosecutors to rehearse my testimony. They reminded me to keep my answers direct, to stay calm even if the defense tried to provoke me. I knew I could do that. After months of living with suspicion and silence, speaking the truth in a clear voice felt like the most natural thing in the world. One evening, I sat by the fire with the orchid on the windowsill, its blooms just beginning to open again. I thought about how something so fragile could endure through months of quiet storms. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes not from absence, but from peace settling back into its corners. The day before my next court appointment, I walked through each room one last time with a camera of my own, not to gather evidence, but to mark the space as it was now, whole, unbroken, and mine. These photographs would stay with me, reminders that even when trust had been taken, safety could be rebuilt. When I returned to the living room, the light from the setting sun spilled across the mantel, catching the frame of the photograph Brian had restored to its place. It struck me then that this chapter was nearly closed. There was still a trial ahead, still questions to be answered in a courtroom, but the core of it was already resolved. The truth was no longer hidden, and I was no longer standing alone in the dark. The courthouse on the first day of the trial felt colder than the winter air outside. The hallways were lined with familiar faces from the legal team, their voices low and steady as we moved toward the courtroom. I sat at the witness table with my hands folded, listening as the judge reviewed the charges and outlined the process for the jury. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline, starting months back when Marissa first began visiting the house more often. Each event was tied to a piece of evidence: video footage, audio recordings, the lab reports from the food samples. They played the first clip on the large screen, showing her in my kitchen, slipping her hand into her pocket before leaning over the cutting board. The room was silent except for the sound of the recording, her voice humming softly. When they called me to the stand, I walked up with a calm I had practiced for weeks. I told the story as I had lived it, starting with the changes I noticed in the food, the decision to keep notes, and the moment I realized it was not just my imagination. I spoke of the cameras, the recordings, and the staged collapse that led to their arrest. I did not look at Marissa or Calloway while I spoke. My focus stayed on the jury, letting them see the truth in my eyes. The defense tried to suggest I had misinterpreted her actions, that the taste in the food could have been a mistake or a coincidence. The prosecutors countered with lab results and timestamps. They showed the jury the sequence of events leading up to the night of the arrest, her calls to Calloway, their plan to divide my assets, their arrival at the house with bags to carry things out. By the second day, the jury had seen enough to understand the pattern. The testimony from Detective Hall and the forensic expert reinforced the link between her visits and the presence of toxins in the samples. Miles testified about the legal documents she had tried to access and the items recovered from their possession. When it came time for closing arguments, the prosecution reminded the jury of the patience and precision that had gone into their plan. They contrasted it with the patience and precision I had used to uncover it. The defense offered little more than an appeal for leniency, citing personal struggles and financial pressures, but the evidence had already spoken. The deliberations were short. The jury returned before the end of the afternoon with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts for both Marissa and Calloway. The judge's voice was firm as she read the sentences, decades in prison for each, without the possibility of early release. I sat still as the decision settled over the room. Marissa's face showed no expression, her eyes fixed ahead. Calloway's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The deputies led them out through the side door, their footsteps fading down the corridor. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was low, casting long shadows across the steps. Hall and Miles walked with me to the car, their words brief but certain. The case was closed. The threat was gone. At home that evening, I lit a fire and sat in the living room with a cup of tea. The orchid on the windowsill had opened another bloom, pale and steady in the glow of the flames. I thought about the long months of watching, recording, and waiting, about the quiet choices that had led to this moment. The trial had not been about revenge. It had been about truth, about ensuring the harm they had intended could never touch me again. The house was silent now, but it was a silence I welcomed. It belonged to me, and so did the life I had rebuilt inside these walls. As night fell, I closed the curtains and let the warmth of the fire fill the room. The chapter was finished. What remained was mine to shape, and I intended to keep it that way. Spring came quietly, softening the edges of winter around the town. The air smelled of salt and new blossoms, and the days grew longer. I found myself spending more time outside, tending to the small garden along the back fence. The rhythm of planting and watering felt grounding, each new sprout a reminder that life continued in its own quiet way. Inside the house, everything had returned to a steady order. The drawers were filled only with what belonged there. The shelves held what I had chosen to keep. The absence of intrusion was its own kind of comfort. I moved through each room without the undercurrent of caution that had once shadowed my steps. Brian came by most weekends. We shared simple meals, talking more easily than before. There was no rushing the process between us, but trust was beginning to take root again. He had started helping with small repairs around the house, fixing a loose hinge, repainting a faded section of trim. These gestures carried their own weight, quiet acknowledgements of the distance we had travelled to stand in the same space again. The trial had left its mark, but not in the way I expected. There was no lingering bitterness, only a deeper awareness of how easily trust can be misplaced and how vital it is to listen to your own instincts. I had learned that patience could be sharper than confrontation, and that the truth, once fully revealed, carried its own strength. The orchid on the windowsill had grown taller, its blooms steady and full. I kept it there as a living reminder of the months when it had watched silently, capturing what I could not yet prove. Now it was simply part of the home again, no longer a tool, but a sign of endurance. I still walked the beach in the early mornings, watching the tide shift. The water's movement had always been a constant, long before all this began. Standing there, I could feel the weight of the past year loosening, carried out with each wave. The horizon seemed wider now, not because it had changed, but because I had. In the evening, I lit the fire and let the house settle around me. The quiet was not empty. It was filled with the sound of my own footsteps, the rustle of turning pages, the faint hum of the kettle in the kitchen. I had taken back my home, my peace, and my voice. That was the ending I needed. The story had begun with loss and suspicion, but it ended with clarity. I knew now that survival was not just about enduring what comes, it was about shaping what remains. And as I closed the final page of this chapter in my life, I did so knowing that the walls around me held only what I chose to keep. If you've been through something that shook the foundation of your trust, you know how hard it can be to rebuild. My story is just one reminder that patience and persistence can uncover the truth without losing yourself along the way. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts or a moment from your own life where you found the strength to stand your ground. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, stay with me for the next journey. Sometimes the quiet victories are the ones that change us the most.